Okay, hello. I wanted to make a video on state charts. I've been thinking a bit more because it's this thing where like xstate has become this library, which is very powerful, and it's almost like a tiny little framework. I would say it's more like a tool, but it has so much API surface and has all these concepts that other state management tools has as well. Things like effects and actions and stuff like that. But at its core, a state machine, what it helps you with, like its core value proposition, it's this stuff. Because now when we write logic and state and basically write applications, we have a tendency to do this. So imagine a login flow, and we would have like one state for is authenticating and another state for is authenticated. Now this is a problem because you can't be in authenticating state and be authenticated at the same time, but we actually allow that state. And then you have errors and stuff on top of that again. So what state machines do is that instead of having these two states, you only have a single state. And that single state describes three different modes in this case. Either you are unauthenticated, you are authenticating, or you are authenticated. You can only be in one of those states. So this is what they mean by making impossible states impossible. And if you would just do this, just this simple thing here, use strings to define your states instead of having is states, you have gotten a long way with this. But what state charts also provides is logic, moving between, it gives you guards for when you are in one state, what other states can you move to? So it's not like just giving you the different states, it's transitioning between them. That is the functionality of a state chart. And then with xstate, you have like all the stuff that comes on top of that again, like your general state, any logic for talking to APIs and whatever. And that's kind of like really outside the core idea of state charts. But or not the core idea of state charts, but outside the core value of state charts, I would say. So anyways, what I'm going to talk about now is a different take on getting the most out of the core value, because as you see in xstate, and Overmind has been heavily influenced by xstate. You have effects and actions, and you have activities, actors. There's tons of different concepts here, but Overmind already has a concept for managing state and writing logic for your application, and also effects. So what would it look like if we made state charts in Overmind a very specific implementation, like just getting this value out of it, like having these states and managing the transitions between them? Okay, so what we are looking at here is the same API, like you have the state chart factory, and it's a factory where you pass in the base configuration of your namespace, and then you give it the chart. And now the chart here is only about states and describing in each state what other states are you allowed to move into. So we start with an imagine a login flow here. You start in an unauthenticated state. In that unauthenticated state, you are allowed to move to a single state called authenticating. When you are in authenticating state, you are allowed to move to two different states. Authenticated, which means it was a success, or you can move back to unauthenticated, which means that it was an error. You could also move to an explicit error state, but typically, if you think about the UI, you do not really move to like a big error thing. You just move back to the unauthenticated state, But maybe you have added an error to your state that you want to display. I'll show that shortly. Anyways, when you are in the authenticated state, you are allowed to move to an unauthenticating state, which means you're basically logging out. And when you are unauthenticating, you are either moving back to the authenticated state because there was an error, meaning you weren't actually logged out. So you're moving back to the authenticated state. Again, the error can be part of your state and you can display it, but you are in the authenticated state. Or you can move to unauthenticated state, which means that the logout was a success. Okay, so this is, I also think this, again, really like declaratively brings out exactly the core value proposition of state charts. Okay, so how would you use this in Overmind? So in Overmind, you have actions, and this is what you do already. You create actions, and when you click a button, you trigger the action. And then you have access to state, effects, and whatever. So what we're doing here is that when we try to log in, we ask the chart, we want to move into authenticating state. This is what we want to do now. And given that we are in the unauthenticated state, yes, indeed, we are allowed to move into authenticating, and it starts running this logic. And now we try to grab the user, and let's say it was a success. Then we want to move into the authenticated state. Given that we are allowed to move into that state, let's set the user. If for some reason there was an error, we rather want to move into the unauthenticated state. Given that we are allowed to move into that state, we will run this logic, setting the error. If for some reason, for example, if you click login once and we move into authenticating, we are allowed to do that, and then you click the button again. It will try to move into the authenticating state again, but it can't do that because it's already in that state. And that would mean that the second time you click the button, this logic wouldn't run at all. And this is like what I mean about this is part of the states. Like, it's not only about setting the states, you also have to manage the transition between those states. And this is how it works. And then we have logout. It's basically the same. We try to move into an authenticating state. If for whatever reason we are not in the authenticated state, it just won't run the logic. But let's say it does run that logic. We try to log out. If it's a success, we move into an authenticated. If it's not a success, we want to move back into authenticated. But maybe there was like some weird event or something that suddenly moved us back into authenticated state. Then this logic wouldn't run, so it wouldn't have set the error, saying that you were that you had an error. So this is how the protection works, and I really like this because this is part of thinking logic. It's very, very, very difficult to describe this in a good way declaratively. Like when you look at the XState API, it's really nice to have all this declarativeness, but for me personally, I think it just becomes too complex. You try to push too much logic into the declarative state chart. So I think there has to be a separation there, and there is a separation in XState as well. But yeah, I think that separation is basically expressing the states, and then you put your logic somewhere else. Or at least that's my suggestion for Overmind state charts. Okay, so you might ask, why do we return all this stuff? The reason is basically because we have to manage potential asynchronous code. So for example here, when we are unauthenticating, we have an async function, and we have to return that from the action to be able to change state asynchronously. And the same goes for these ones. You just return it in case they run some asynchronous code. Yes. So what about entry and exit? Because that's also an important part of state charts. You can like say, whenever I move into this state, do this. Whenever I move out of a state, do this. So the way I think about this is that, let's imagine we have a dashboard. We have two buttons. You can go to issues and you can go to projects. So, and when you're on the issues, the transitions you can do is to projects, and on projects you can go back to issues. And each of these states has a nested state where you have a list where you can move between an item and the list itself. Same for projects, no biggie. So you have created an action. So when you click the issues in the UI, you trigger the open issues action. What you do here is that you try to move into the issue state of the chart. And given that you are allowed to do that, you will run this logic here where you set up a subscription. So the API gives you like an on issues type of subscription, and whenever new issues arrive, you fire off a different action. But as you can see here, we also have a second argument here, which is also a function, and this function runs when you exit the issue state. So for whatever reason the issue state is exited, like you move into transitioning to a different state, it will run this function. And the same goes for open projects. So what you might want to do here instead of a subscription, maybe you want to fire off an action to clean up something. So you could do like actions, clean up issues, for example. You could do that as well. This kind of like removes, like when you define entry and exit and actions, you also need to define the logic within them. So either you can duplicate this by having it declaratively in the state chart and in an implementation, and you have to kind of like see how they are linked, or you can just drop that. You can just have it as part of the implementation. I'm not saying that it's wrong to have it declaratively, and it also helps like the visualizer and stuff. But again, I don't think that there's like 80% value in seeing the different states. There's 80% value in this, defining the states, showing you how you can transition between those states. That's 80% of the value in my mind. And then you have all the other API surface of state charts. That is like the last 20%, which is for me very hard to reason about. For me, it's much easier to reason about something like this, because it's part of the logic and pointing to the existing state, and that's very interesting. So if you would have like the actions as part of this declarative thing, you wouldn't understand what those actions actually do. You would kind of like have to jump back and forth between the declarative part and the implementation part to like figure out what it does. But that's not really interesting either in the declarative part, I think. Anyways, I'm going back and forth and I started to ramble. I really want to implement this. One thing is, I think it's a much better fit for Overmind, but it's also taking the concept of state charts, and rethinking it a little bit. Like how does it make sense to use state charts in a state management solution? Okay, so I started thinking again. I should really be working with Code Sandbox, but that's the thing about me. I have to get these ideas out of my head or I can't focus. So what I realized is that there's a difference between state machines and state charts. So state machines is this core value I've been talking about, where you just have some states and then you express how these states can be transitioned between, how you can transition between the states. State charts, on the other hand, is there for actually building applications. They have all this other stuff. So like you can build a fully complete application with, for example, XState. But Overmind is already a tool for building applications. What Overmind is missing isn't state charts as a concept, it's missing state machines. Because you have a tendency in Overmind to do this is loading, blah, blah, blah. So I started thinking we can keep state charts as is. Personally, I haven't used them because I'm having a hard time figuring out where they fit in. Yes, but other people wanted it, so I provided it. But I think maybe this state machine will be something that is way more beneficial. It's way easier to understand. Oh yes, I should have a state machine here. And the way this can be implemented, and it's a super simple implementation. I just did a rough mock-up of the code and it's super simple. Actually, you can look at it. So, I called it. So what it is, it's a derived state. And that's basically it. This stuff. It will probably be a little bit more, but that's basically it. But yeah, so the way it works, I have an authentication flow here. I'm calling it mode. So what mode is the authentication flow in? And I've defined the states and how you can transition between them. And now in my action, I'm rather pointing to state mode. And it gives me these states as functions. So it works exactly the same way. You call it because you want to move to that state, and if you can, it will run the logic. So that's basically exactly the same. No biggie there. And then in your components. So in a component, let's see, I can show it here. Like, it doesn't matter if it's a component or an action. You can point to state, mode, current. And that gives you like authenticating or whatever state you're in. So you have that. And you will also have state, mode, reset. So what reset does is basically putting you back into the initial state. So that is something you would use, for example, when moving between, let's say you have a dashboard, you have issues and projects. When you move to projects, you start listening to something. And when you move back to issues, you really want to reset the projects to its initial state. And that is what you do with reset. It allows you, when you move to issues, to reset the projects, for example. And because that's a thing with state charts in Overmind now, the whole chart has to be within one namespace. And that's also not ideal, because you really want to split up your logic. But anyways, for me personally, I know exactly where to start using this, and I will start using this. So I will implement this. And it will just become this factory function you can implement and insert into your state. And then we'll see how do people feel about this? Does actually state machines solve the issue? Or do you really need state charts in Overmind to solve certain situations? And I want to see those situations because they aren't apparent to me where you want to use them. So yeah, that's basically it. Related to what I said like in my previous recording, I'm not going to throw away state charts at all. They will stay as is, but I will introduce this machine thing where you can put it into your state. And manage it that way. Cool. Thanks. I hope this made even more sense. So thank you and bye-bye.